Thank you all for joining us for this presentation of the research by the students of the 2021 Outer Banks Field Site, or OBXFS. My name is Lindsay Dubbs. I'm the director of the OBXFS, and together with my colleagues, Linda Dana, associate director and Professors Andy Keeler and Lee Leidy, we'd like to first thank the Fessenden Center for hosting us today. We typically do this final presentation at the Coastal Studies Institute on the East Carolina University Outer Banks campus, which is in Wanchese, but we're really happy to be here in the community where this research took place this year. So thank you, Susan, and everyone here at the Fessenden Center, if you can hear me, for opening your doors to us. For those of you who don't know about the OBXFS, we are a UNC Chapel Hill Institute for the Environment, Study Abroad, an environment, ecology, and energy program offered for undergraduate students, and we are grateful to be hosted by the Coastal Studies Institute, as I said. Undergraduate students have spent the fall semester here on the Outer Banks through this program and its predecessor, the Albemarle Ecological Field Site, for the past 20 years. Students participate in experiences and multidisciplinary classes regarding coastal communities, and they participate in internships with organizations across the Outer Banks. And to that end, I'd like to thank all of our internship organizations and mentors for the real-world, rewarding experiences that they offer to our students. We have some mentors in the room. We'd also like to thank our Community Advisory Board, composed of members of the Outer Banks community, who facilitate community interactions and provide additional context for their studies. We also have Community Advisory Board members in the room, so that's very nice. We are grateful to several people and organizations who especially helped make the Capstone research project a success. Kathy Mitchell, Plant ID VIP, and Anya Leach of CSI were integral to executing vegetation surveys. Robert Peet, professor at UNC Chapel Hill and co-creator of the Carolina Vegetation Survey, provided a lot of guidance about the methodology for vegetation and data from the 1988 study you're going to hear about. Susan West of Raising the Story has helped to provide guidance from the early stages of this project. Thank you. Eric Alnez, thank you. Brandon Puckett and Rebecca Ellen from the Coastal Reserve, North Carolina Coastal Reserve and National Estuarine Research Reserve share data and insights that help this project get off the ground. Sorry, mask readjustment. Finally, thank you to Elliot Midget and Pat Irwin, who shared salinity data from the Dare County Water Department within a day of our request. As you watch this presentation, keep in mind that these 11 students arrived just in mid-August, and in just 4 months, they learned how to do quantitative and qualitative research, to learn new things while also spending time and learning about the natural and human communities of this region. This is a huge undertaking for undergraduate students, and we are very proud of them and their work. If we could keep them here longer, we would love to, and we know that we would have a lot more to say about this topic. Another thing that we want to make you aware of, although I don't think you can ignore it, is that we are recording this presentation, and the recording will be available on CSI's website, YouTube channel rather, next week, thanks to CSI's John McCord and Blake Williams. One goal of the Capstone Research Project is to do research relevant to our surrounding community, and the other is for the students to learn in the process. We hope that you will have feedback and suggestions to refine and expand upon their ideas for future research and new ways to consider their data. We request, however, that you reserve your comments and questions for the end of the presentation. Finally, there is a written report that accompanies this presentation that you can access next week on the UNC Institute for the Environment website by just Googling OBXFS, and you can download it. And with that, I would like to present the students of the 2021 Outer Banks Field Site.
My name is Mackenzie Douglas. I'm from Spruce Pine, North Carolina, and thanks for coming.
Hi, my name is Jane Bailey. I'm from Leonardtown, Maryland, and I interned with the North Carolina Coastal Reserve.
Hi, I'm Steve Yoon. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I interned with the Town of Nags Head, the Planning Department.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Littauer. I'm from Asheville, North Carolina, and I interned at the NC Aquarium on Roanoke Island.
Hello, I'm Francesca Fraudiani. I'm from Nyack, New York, and I interned with the Pea Island Preservation Society.
Hi, my name is Anna Jar. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and I interned with the planning department at the town of Nags Head.
Hi, my name is Jason Reynolds. I'm from Indian Trail, North Carolina, and I interned with Paul Paris, a researcher at the Coastal Studies Institute.
Hello, I'm Keenan Reeder. I'm from Nags Head, and I intern with the National Park Service.
Hello, I'm Blakely Durham. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I intern with the North Carolina Coastal Federation.
Hi, my name is Natalie Urarte Ayala, and I'm from Pink Hill, North Carolina, and I intern at Island Farm.
Hello, my name is Joseph Hernandez, and I interned with the Nature Conservancy at Nags Head Woods. Thank you. All right, so hello, everyone. As Lindsay mentioned, we are the 2021 Outer Banks Field Site Group. We are here today to present our Capstone research project, which we have been working on all semester. It is titled A Temporal Analysis of Vegetation Dynamics and Community Perceptions of Buxton Woods. So, for our project, we were interested in barrier islands, specifically Hatteras Island, and even more specifically, we're interested in Buxton Woods, which is one of the largest remaining maritime forests in the southeast United States. The Buxton Woods was protected by the North Carolina Coastal Reserve in 1988, which has left it largely undeveloped and untouched, which made it perfect for our study. So the purpose of our project. So we were interested in examining the change in vegetative communities throughout Buxton Woods from 1988 to 2021. We were able to do this by examining a Carolina vegetation survey from 1988 and comparing that to what we found now. We were also interested in examining local Buxton residents' perception of change in Buxton Woods, and we did that through a series of interviews that we conducted. So I know a lot of you guys might already know some of what I'm about to say, given that you guys are from Hatteras Island and the Outer Banks, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So what is a barrier island? A barrier island is a coastal landform that is a part of a chain of islands that form through the accumulation of sand that is brought through tidal and wave energy. These barrier islands act as a form of protection for the mainland. They are ever-changing and very dynamic systems as they are influenced by many natural forces such as wind, wave, tides, and storms, as well as sea level change. There's a lot of unique vegetation communities found on these barrier islands due to the unique coastal conditions that they have to withstand in order to survive on these islands. There's a lot of natural processes that are also acting on the barrier islands, such as the storms, sediment transport, and sea level change. So here we have a diagram of how maritime forests kind of forms on these barrier islands. So first, here we have this foredune. This foredune absorbs much of the wave and wind energy that is coming from the ocean. This foredune allows for the wind to blow back some more sand and form this smaller dune behind it. The foredune kind of acts as like a form of protection for that dune behind it, given that it's absorbing much of that wind and wave energy. So now this dune is able to establish some vegetation which roots into the dune and kind of establishes itself there. Then some more wind will blow back more sand and form an even bigger dune in the back. This dune is protected by this somewhat established dune in front of it, so this one goes largely undisturbed, which allows for some organic material to begin to accumulate on that dune. And with that organic material, we have the vegetation that begins to grow, and our maritime forest begins to grow and establish itself. So what is a maritime forest? A maritime forest is an older forest ecosystem. It seems to form in the areas of the barrier island that go largely undisturbed. They have a lot of unique vegetation given the coastal conditions that the vegetation has to adapt to and withstand in order to survive, such as wind, salinity, sandy soils, and storms. This vegetation begins to grow. The bigger trees form a canopy. It kind of acts as a dome of protection for the interior of the forest, giving some protection to those smaller vegetative communities. Within these maritime forests, you will find a lot of dune and swale ecosystems. A swale is just like a low-lying area between the two dunes where some fresh water might accumulate. And these maritime forests are important because they're oftentimes on top of freshwater aquifers, which are very important to the vegetative communities as well as the human communities on these islands. So now I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Natalie, who will go a little bit deeper into the details of our study.
Thank you, Joseph, for starting us off. So in this next slide, I have our study site where our location for our study was on Hatteras Island, as you can see right here on this map. And the green layer just represents Buxton Woods, as you can see right here, and the star just represents our sampling location of where we took our vegetation samples. So Buxton Wood is a coastal and estuarine research reserve, and its mission is to promote informed management and and its mission is to, okay, I'm gonna just move on with my bad. Sorry, I'm blanking. So our study site was on Buxton Woods, but the reason why we chose Buxton Wood is because it's one of the largest remaining largest continuous maritime forests on the Atlantic coast, and one of the largest remaining maritime forests on the Atlantic coast. And I'm sorry. So the largest remaining maritime forest on the Atlantic coast. And the reason why we chose it is because it's, okay, can I just move on? I'm sorry. So Buxton Woods has had human influence on it. So in the past, Buxton Woods was mainly used for cattle grazing, logging, and hunting. And so this cattle grazing has impacted the vegetation communities on it because, they trampled the vegetation and they also ate the vegetation. And in the past, logging, it depleted the live oaks within that area. So it influenced the ecosystem within the forest. And also in more recent times, there have been more man-made dunes and development, and this has more development on Hatteras Island, and these have influences the shape and stability of barrier islands. So one example I've chosen right here is the groundwater. So on Hatteras Island, there has been more development, and so as more development occurs, there are more impervious surfaces. So that leads to less water going into the aquifer, leads to less time going into the aquifers underneath it. So it leads to a loss of groundwater recharge and how long it stays there. So as humans influence Buxton Woods, we also wanted to see a connection with the human dimensions to the natural system in our research. So we wanted to see how the residents of Buxton perceive the changes within Buxton Woods. So that is where we make the connection of their natural system and the human dimensions. So that leads us to our research question. The first one has to do more with our human dimension sides, which is, what are the uses, values, and perception of change in Buxton Woods among stakeholders and nearby residents? We will go over this in the beginning of the presentation. And later on in the presentation, we'll go over our more natural system, which is has the vegetated community structure and composition and historical plots in Buxton Woods changed since 1988? So Francesca will lead us off with our human dimension slides and discuss the methods.
All right, thank you, Natalie. So in our research, we split off kind of into two groups. One group's covering natural systems and conducting a vegetative analysis of Buxton Woods, and our research in human dimensions. The human dimensions was more qualitative. We wanted to get really in-depth results with a small number of subjects. So I'll be covering the methods for that. We conducted interviews with residents and locals that were recommended to us by the community, using a guide of open-ended questions to ensure flexibility in the responses of each individual interviewee. Some examples of questions that we used were, how would you describe Buxton Woods to someone who's never been there? What was the process of preservation? And what does Buxton Woods mean to you? Each student conducted an interview, so there was a total of 11 interviews, and each interview lasted roughly an hour, with some going up to an hour and a half. We then transcribed and coded our interviews and the process of coding is basically just taking portions out of a transcribed interview and categorizing them into relevant categories. This allowed us to collate our findings and kind of pull out these broad themes across all of our interviews so that we could analyze them further. So in total, we had 29 different codes, all of which fell underneath one of these 4 categories: Buxton Woods, community, process of preservation, and memorable quotes or anecdotes. So here's a couple of examples that we took from the interviews to show you how we coded them. But when you start in Buxton, you go first through a pine forest, and then it becomes an oak forest, and then you come into pure white sand dunes. It's really cool. So this quote we took out of the entire interview and put underneath the umbrella of Buxton Woods, but more specifically into the environmental descriptions of Buxton Woods. So any descriptions that people gave to let us know what Buxton Woods was like, how a maritime forest is, and how they perceived it. There was some heated times. Some people tried to villainize the people involved with it. This was in reference to the Friends of Hatteras group, so it went underneath tensions in the process of preservation. So being able to take out these portions from the interviews really allowed us to see consistencies and contrasts between all of the different interviews so that we could conduct a really thorough analysis. And Blakely is going to get into more of the analysis with you guys.
Yes, so as Francesca mentioned, after doing all our coding, there was 2 main themes that emerged from our interviews. The first was why Buxton Woods matters to the Hatteras Island community, and the second was changes to Buxton Woods and community perceptions. So in each interview, we asked, what do Buxton Woods mean to you? And we got a variety of responses, but the one that seemed to sum them all up was everything. So how did Buxton Woods develop this meaning? Well, our interviewees explained that in the past, Buxton Woods was used for logging for shipbuilding, cattle and livestock grazing, and as a place to build homes because it provided protection from the storms. Now, all 3 of these uses point to the main value of Buxton Woods at the time being as a way to sustain yourself and your family. However, our interviewees also indicated that over time these uses shifted, and now the uses focus more on recreation, with some of the main uses being biking and walking. Now, hunting and trapping still exists in the woods, but it's mostly for personal enjoyment rather than as a way to sustain yourself. And as these uses shifted, so did values. One interviewee described Buxton Woods as an escape area. I can walk for 30 minutes, an hour, and just get my head in perspective. So this highlights one of the main values of Buxton Woods today, as it's a place to escape from the bustling tourist economy of the Outer Banks. Another value that continuously came up that prevailed from the past was the aquifer. One interviewee said, Buxton Woods was sitting on top of our water, our aquifer. That was what probably began saving it. It was the fact that it was our drinking water underneath. The location of Buxton Woods above the aquifer was one of the key reasons why the Friends of Hatteras started fighting to protect it. They were concerned about threatening this key value of Buxton Woods. And they succeeded in protecting it. It became a part of the coastal reserve. But even with this preservation, there are still some concerns about different things threatening the values of Buxton Woods. And one of those our interviewer described was that Buxton Woods is going to get paths and trails and people. They're concerned that with increased access and increased visitors, Buxton Woods is going to lose its ability to be the escape that's so valued, because you can't escape to the woods if that's where all the people are. Another concern that commonly came up was disturbances. One person said, if the woods was gone, overwashed and stuff, where would we be? It's really important to keep it there if we want to live here. Any event, whether it be storm or development, that gets into the canopy, gets into the woods, it can make it vulnerable, and that threatens a lot of these key values because they rely on the woods being kept intact. Again, you can't escape to the woods if the woods aren't there anymore. So I'm now going to turn it over to Keenan, who's going to talk about our second theme.
All right. In this section, I'll be talking about the significant factors our interviewees provided to us that they believe are driving the change in Buxton Woods and how they perceive of these changes. So the first major change they discussed was the disruption of the canopy, and we picked out specific quotes from our interviews that we believe are the representative of the collective opinions of these factors. So we have here, the interior trees are more protected, and now there's been so many homes built. It allows the interior wind to get in there and salt. So your interior trees are now surfing like the perimeter trees. They're explaining here how increased development around the edges of Buxton Woods has opened up the canopy, exposing the inner layers and making it more vulnerable to external disturbances like salt spray. So another common thing many of our interviewees talked about was saltwater intrusion. So saltwater intrusion is when saltwater infiltrates and contaminates the underground aquifer through things like storm surge and the rising of the freshwater lens. You can see where salt water has intruded into the early parts of the forest, and you can start to see the deaths of some of our live oaks and the bigger trees and things that can't take the salt. So as you may know, the aquifer is an essential part of Buxton Woods, providing clean water to the surrounding communities. So threats to the aquifer pose a significant threat to the community itself. In terms of environmental damage, saltwater intrusion can kill all the vegetation in the low-lying areas, and it also unbalances the relationship between the inland freshwater systems and the ocean. So tourism was another common theme talked about, which can influence both Buxton Woods and especially the community. They explained how they have seen a substantial increase in tourism in the past few years, which can increase the amount of human impact and influence in Buxton Woods, and also increases the amount of development needed to sustain that tourist economy. Our interviewees also talked about how the composition of tourists have changed over the years, with them nowadays lacking a sense of place or place attachment, with less eco-friendly attitudes. We became a tourist destination. That's our primary input now, is just the tourists. Our interviewers also talked about how the increase in accessibility in the past and future can alter the structure of the woods, and there were both positive and negative outlooks of increased accessibility. So this is the negative. The more people you get back in there, the more damage that could happen to it. So increased accessibility increases the amount of human impact in the woods, and it also increases, the amount of development you need to actually allow them to get in. While on the other hand, we took a walk on the nature trail. There have been little plaques that explain everything, which is very good. So in this point of view, increased use and accessibility of the woods actually increase the value, as more people are actually interested in preserving that use area. So while these other factors do influence the woods, our interviewers explained how severe climate and weather events are the most powerful drivers of change in Buxton Woods. I feel like after Hurricane Emily in '93, the woods and my husband and I on our property sustained the greatest tragedy that I've lived through in Buxton Woods. Many of our interviewees talked specifically about Hurricane Emily as the most destructive single event Buxton Woods has faced. So now we'll transition over to the natural systems, starting with Jane and the methods.
All right, thank you, Keenan. So we just finished part of our discussion on the human dimension systems of our project, and now we're going to shift our focus to discussing the natural systems. I'm going to start with methodology, and then we'll move on to our findings and conclusions. So just to reorient you guys, off to our left is our map of Hatteras Island and Buxton Woods, and our sampling location is denotated with the star. And then off to our right, we have the location of our 3 plots. And we decided to denotate these plots with particular names that were indicative of their location. So plot 0209 was considered the Lowland Dune system, 0207 was considered a swale, and 0206 was called the Upland Dune system. So we picked these names because while we were in the plot systems, we noticed topographical and hydrological differences. So the Upland Dune system is going to be higher in the Maritime Forest, and it's going to be in a drier system. On the other side of things, we have the swale plot. So the swale plot is going to be lower in the Maritime Forest and is going to have more hydric soils. So the soils there are going to be more water saturated. So now that we know where our plots are, what did we actually do there? So for our methods section, we wanted to take a step back and look at our research question. So our research question for natural systems was we wanted to analyze the changes that occurred from our 88 survey that we looked at, conducted by Tessel and Pete, and we wanted to compare that to data that we obtained in 2021. So in order to do that assessment of change, we used the Carolina Vegetative Survey method. And with the model that you can see here, we utilized a plot system, which comprises these 5 boxes. So while we're in the woods, we outlay this plot, and then just to make it like a little more digestible for us to go through this area, we also use a module system. So for 2 of our plots, the upland and the lowland dune system, we covered this entire area. And then for our swale system, we only did a module. So now that we're in these modules, what did we do with the vegetation? So we had 2 systems of quantification, cover and stems. And cover is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. If you have a plant that's in front of you and it's covering the ground, that's considered cover. And we also had stems, which was the terminology that we utilized for any like woody species, such as established trees or saplings. So for cover, we looked at 2 specific things. We looked at ground cover, which is what's covering the ground, and strata, which is the area that it comprises in the vertical composition of the plot. So like what's actually going on like up and down. So imagine you're a researcher, you're walking through Buxton Woods, and you come across a species of poison ivy. It's kind of hard to see like how much area that this covers within this module, but if you imagine all of the leafy parts of the species clumped into the corner of this plot, you can see that it's a little less than a third of this area. So we considered this about 10 to 25% of this module. So for every species, we went along, ID'd it, we're like, okay, it comprises about this much area, and we wrote it down. So that's pretty much ground cover. And then for strata, we had a similar method. So we walk along, we ID a species, and then we say, okay, how much of this is comprising what's on the ground, kind of around like knee height, what's about shrub height, so from like chest to about 5 meters, and then trees, we said anything above 5 meters, that's what we would quantify that as. So again, another example, if you're walking along and you have an established loblolly pine tree and then a bunch of saplings in front of you, I might say, okay, so within this plot, I have about maybe 5% is in this tree height category. But then if I have a lot of saplings that are also around me, maybe 10% of this would be considered the shrub height. We wrote that down on our paper, and that's how we did ground cover. So for stems, and this was for any woody species, if it was 137.5 centimeters, so we standardize it with our friend Blakely, so if anything was her shoulder height. We would then mark it with a flag and then find the diameter. So we did this throughout all of our plots, wrote it down in our data sheets, and that was how we comprised our methodology. So now I'm going to pass it off to Anna, and she's going to discuss some of our findings.
Thank you, Jane. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more on the cover, as Jane just discussed, which is more about the community composition found within the vegetative plot. So I'm going to start here with our first plot, which was plot 0206, but was the upland dune plot, which, if you remember, as Jane discussed, is most likely the drier dune. And so here I have a pie chart depicting the composition of the vegetation found within that area. And for simplicity's sake, none of the plants that were found at less than 5% are labeled. So here, this is from 1988, and the 1988 plot was mainly comprised of loblolly pine, oak, flowering dogwood, and ironwood. And switching to 2021, we can see that there is a shift in community composition. So now the plot is mainly comprised of oak, American holly, ironwood, loblolly pine, and wax myrtle. And by looking at them side to side, we can see that American holly went from less than 5% to comprising 26.7% of the community. Flowering dogwood went from 27.7% to 0%, which is a really big difference. Loblolly pine decreased by over 50%, while oak almost doubled, and wax myrtle made a small but noticeable difference and just made it over the 5% standard. So go wax myrtle. Looking at our next plot, we're looking at plot 0207, or the swale plot. So this was most likely the plot going to be inundated or have wet soil more frequently. And so in 1988, the swale plot was mostly comprised of red bay, rattan vine, loblolly pine, and swamp dogwood. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but the pictures here have border colors that match the color of them on the pie chart, so you guys can visualize what we were seeing in the woods. And we can see a really big difference at this plot in 2021, which was now reduced to just muscadine, grape, and swamp dogwood. And so swamp dogwood almost doubled. Red bay, rattan vine, and loblolly pine had sizable decreases, and muscadine grape kind of appeared and now comprised a somewhat significant portion of this plot. And lastly, we're going to talk about plot 0209, or the lowland dune. And this plot is especially significant because this is where we saw the most notable change throughout all of our plots. So in 1988, it was mostly comprised of ironwood, flowering dogwood, loblolly pine, red bay, and oak. And in 2021, it was mostly comprised of loblolly pine, ironwood, American holly, yelpine holly, and red bay. And looking at these side to side, we can see that there is a big difference in the colors of the pie chart, but also in the composition of the plot. So ironwood over doubled. Flowering dogwood again disappeared completely. Red bay held relatively steady. Loblolly pine decreased by over half. And yelpine holly and American holly became more prevalent, while oak shrank down a bunch. And some points that I want to mention about this plot is that it's also the one that's closest to the trails. So this plot was nearby more human interaction, which is especially interesting, and species like oak and pine are more susceptible to wind events, as we discussed earlier in the human dimensions with Hurricane Emily. These taller species are more susceptible to being damaged during high windstorms and events like that. While yelpine holly and American holly prefer understory, so they thrive better in shade. So these were just some of the differences that we noticed. That we found especially interesting, and future research could look at maybe indicators of why these changes occurred. And I'm going to talk a little bit more and summing it all up. So the results of species richness and composition, where species richness is the number of species in the area, and composition is what kind of species are actually in that area. So we found 44 species were recorded in 1988, and 47 were recorded in 2021. So this means that species richness held relatively constant over this period of time. And when 2021, we noticed that 11 species disappeared and 20 new species appeared in the plots. And again, mentioning back to plot 0209, why it was significantly important was we found that 4 species disappeared from this plot alone and 11 new species were found in this plot alone. So something crazy really happened there. So we found about the same number of species, but a different makeup of species. And I'm gonna hand it off to Jason to reiterate other ways that we can look at our data and talk more about stems.
Thank you, Anna. So Anna really looked at the one component of our natural science research question with the composition. I'm going to look now at the other side of that with forest structure. And so forest structure has its own components, relative abundance of and the average cover of woody stem species, herbaceous species, and vine species. And another component of structure is derived from the woody stem data counts as well as their sizes. So first looking at the relative abundances of these species, Anna just talked about the total number of species that we found in our plots. We looked at those species and we said, hey, is this a tree species, an herbaceous species, or a vine species? And for 1988, we can see that we have about the same number of each of those types of species. But in 2021, we have 24 herbaceous species, which is now over half. So we've grown to a forest that is more dominated by herbaceous species. And with that in mind, we asked ourselves, hey, would we see more herbaceous species in the cover data for 2021 as well? And when we looked at that, we found that for 2 of our plots, the upland dune and swale plot, this was not the case. We looked at those pie charts to sort of visually see, like, okay, is this a majority woody stem species or herbaceous and vine species? But for our lowland dune plot, which Anna mentioned was significant, we actually did see what we would expect. And between 1988 and 2021, we saw more herbaceous species making up cover. And our lowland dune plot would again be of interest for stem count and sizes that we'll talk about in just a minute. But first, looking at the stem sizes for all of our plots, there are 2 big trends that I want to point to here. First, in 1988, you can see that a majority of the stems were of the smallest size classes. Meanwhile, in 2021, we see a shift to some of those medium to larger size classes. The other trend is in 1988, you see that there's a noticeable amount of the largest size classes as well. Meanwhile, in 2021, we see a noticeable drop-off of those largest size classes. So we're seeing a shift to more of the medium size classes in that forest. So that's stem sizes, but now what about stem counts? We looked at stem counts, and I just want to say that for all of our plots together, in 1988, they only found 91 stems, and we found 132. So a noticeable amount of new stems that we found. But just because of the significance that we had seen by plot, specifically our lowland dune, we wanted to again break that down. And so we looked at how the counts had changed by plot. And you can see that for the upland dune and the swale, there was almost no change. So almost all of the 41 new stems that we found were in that lowland dune plot. And we found over double the stems that were found in 1988. So we wanted to see if maybe the lowland dune plot was driving the overall trends that we were seeing. And when we recreated that same figure for just that plot, we saw again a shift from mostly the lower size classes to the medium size classes, and again an even more pronounced disappearance of those larger and largest size classes. And so we were definitely seeing changes to forest structure. We were seeing a maturation of the forest, so we're seeing a movement to larger stem sizes, indicating that those saplings and trees are getting older. But we were also maybe seeing impacts to canopy structure. As Joseph had mentioned, the canopy is an important and really key feature of a maritime forest. And when we're losing those largest size classes and the outlier trees, we're likely losing the canopy trees that are the biggest, the tallest, have those highest leaves that are over the forest overall. So to kind of wrap up our natural systems data, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms that might explain why we are seeing some of these changes. So the first one that we'll talk about is moisture. It's documented that we have seen sea level rise overall since 1988, and what that can be doing is sort of pushing up that freshwater lens. So we're seeing a greater presence of water in some of our lower areas, and that is actually supported by the fact that we're seeing more water-tolerant species, so a greater presence of species that do well in wetter soils. Another factor that could be impacted by the movement of that freshwater is salinity. So we could be seeing more mixing, more saltwater intrusion that was mentioned earlier. And so we looked at some nearby well data, and although that data only starts in the mid-2000s, we were able to determine that at least recently, over the time period from the 2000s to the present, we're likely not seeing more salinity from saltwater intrusion specifically. But it certainly could be coming from other mechanisms, and we have reason to believe that because we actually saw that of the 11 species that disappeared, all of them had some kind of intolerance for salt. So that indicated likely a greater presence of salt. And then the last mechanism that we want to talk about that has been mentioned multiple times is changes to the canopy. As I had talked about and as we saw in our data, we were seeing less of the largest size classes of stems, so less of those largest trees that are likely those canopy trees. And when we have a decrease in those trees, we could see more opening up of that dense protective layer that's key of a maritime forest. And when we're losing that protective layer, we could be more vulnerable to things like pollution. Another mechanism that could come from changes to the canopy is an increase in resources to the lower levels of the forest. So if we're seeing more gaps like are shown in this picture, we could expect to see more sunlight reaching the ground in the forest. And with that, that's more resources for some of those herbaceous species that we actually saw an increase of. And so those are some of the mechanisms for change that we have explored and definitely see as possible. And now to begin to wrap up our presentation, I'm going to hand it over to Mackenzie and the conclusion team.
Thank you, Jason. Okay. So in conclusion, through our human dimensions analysis, we found that Buxton Woods, it's the heartbeat of the island. With talking to interviewees, we heard about the importances of Buxton Woods to them, specifically the fact that it gave them a sense of place. It provided protection to the aquifer beneath it, as well as the community of Hatteras Village surrounding it. It also added to their well-being simply because it existed as an escape from the bustling and continually busy city of Hatteras Island. And much like the natural systems team, us human dimensions team noticed shifts of uses, specifically from historically for sustenance-based purposes to currently for more recreational uses, and pardon my mask, I'm sorry about that. But with those shifts in uses, we saw a shift in values from historical use values to more current aesthetically based values. And amongst our interviewees, we noticed a variance in the different values that people had based on the types of users they were of the Buxton Woods. And based on these different types of users of the woods, people interacted with the woods differently, so they had different perspectives of changes that were going on in the Buxton Woods. And an emergent piece of data that we saw from the human dimensions side of our research was that there were many varying opinions on the future uses of Buxton Woods, specific to accessibility. So people were on different ends of the spectrum. Some individuals wanted to see less people in the woods, whereas others wanted to see more accessible paved paths and parking lots and guided signs for the trails. So this is something that we wanted to make specific note of because it's going to be important for our friends at the Coastal Reserve whenever they look to doing into different management plans for the future. And one thing that we saw almost unanimous across all of our interviews was the common concern with the disruption to the canopy of the Buxton Woods. And now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Rebecca, who's going to talk about the ecological significance of that.
Yes, thank you, Mackenzie. So I'm going to be covering a natural systems recap for our natural systems research. Thanks. So first, we noticed a difference in plant composition throughout the plots that we sampled. We saw a rise and decline in several species. We saw the loss or an absence of 11 species, and all of those had little to no salt tolerance. So that suggested there might be an increase of presence of salt in the plots that we sampled. We also saw the emergence of 20 new species that were not seen in 1988, and these species were mostly herbaceous, suggesting a more overall change to a more herbaceous cover in the forest. We also had a change in forest structure. We saw an increase in overall woody stems and a shift in those woody stems to fill a more mid-sized region rather than large trees. We saw a decrease in those large trees, and that suggests some disruption to the canopy, whether that be from storms or development. And most notably in our plots, in our Lowland Dune plot, we noticed the biggest difference in our forest structure and our forest composition. And this is potentially due to its nearness and proximity to the road and development and the disruption to the canopy nearby caused by that development. And lastly, we noticed, and while there is a difference in our across our plots, we did notice that there is differences with the plant composition and the forest structure from 1988 to 2021. That is all natural. Maritime forests are dynamic and changing, and Buxton Woods is no exception. And so while we did see changes in the forest composition and structure, we also did see similarities in the biodiversity and species richness, which are both encouraging indicators of a healthy forest. And now I'm going to pass it on to Steve for our limitations and exits.
All right, thank you so much, Rebecca. I don't know about you guys, but my heart is beating really fast right now, but it'll be okay. Okay, so thank you so much, Rebecca. As you guys could see, we worked really hard to understand the changes in Buxton Woods and to understand how the community perceived these changes. And also, as Rebecca has noted, and something that I really want to emphasize is we expected to see change in our Buxton Woods. You know, maritime forests, they are very dynamic. We constantly see changes, and these changes are natural. So that is one thing that we want to emphasize. Yes, maritime forests are important. But one thing that I want to say was every great study has their limitations. And our study, which was also great, has limitations. So our limitation was in the sample size. We conducted 11 interviews, and we sampled 3 out of the 8 vegetative plots from 1988. And this is because we want to collect data that has great depth. We talked extensively with our interviewees for over an hour. We spent hours and hours in our plots, measuring cover data and digging for samples. It was a lot of work, and we wanted high-quality data because we wanted our research to be built upon in future research. So here are some examples. One possible future example, so for our research, we used salinity data that came from wells that are in Buxton Wood, but not necessarily from the plots we examined. So a possible future research might be, hey, like they could come in and they could look at water that is sourced directly from the plot, and they could look at other factors like soil characteristics or water quality. Another possible research is looking at how storms impact the vegetative community of our maritime forest. This is especially relevant with future predictions of more intense storms. Okay, and then, so in addition to our research possibly being a cornerstone for future research, there are also other values that our research provides. One example is, so you might have noticed that we collected different types of data, right? So we first collected our quantitative data, which is our cover and stem data, and we also collected qualitative data, that is our interviews. This was really important and essential for our research because it allowed us to make really great insights that are necessary. And one example of that is our canopy structures, right? Our human interviews, our interviewees, they noted that they were starting to see changes in the canopy, our big canopies. And our natural data suggested that. Our natural data supported it. So one thing by collecting two different types of data did was it allowed us to get a more clear and more full picture of the changes in Buxton Woods. Another reason why collecting two different types of data was important is because it informs future management. So let's explore the example of accessibility. We noted from our human dimension data that some residents want the trails to be more accessible, while some residents doesn't want the trails to be more accessible. Well, our natural data will be able to inform management the impacts of increasing accessibility. And hopefully this will encourage our management to better reflect values of the community of Buxton Woods. Okay, so overall, our research provided great insight into the changes of Buxton Woods, and it is a great first step for future research to build upon and for community management of our beloved Buxton Woods. Thank you so much. Rebecca would just say our final thank you.
Yes, so before we get to our question and answer conversation, we want to give a big thank you to our professors, Lindsay Dubbs, Linda Dana, Andy Keeler, and Lee Leidy, who are here today. So we're really thankful for them and all their support during our capstone and our semester, as well as our field technicians, Anya from Lindsay's lab, and Kathy, who's here with us today. So thank you to our interviewees who contributed to our project and all of those who've been here to support us this semester. So here's a big list of people that we are really thankful for and appreciate. Clap for them. All right. And now we welcome any comments, questions, and suggestions you all have for us.
Yeah, so we are hoping that this year especially because we're joined by community members and we're here in your community, if you have suggestions, new insights to add, please let us know. We welcome them. I'm going to come around with a microphone. I don't know if it's on, but okay. We're going to come around with a microphone so that we can make sure that we record your questions and comments as well.
Thank you all very much. I found this absolutely fascinating, and particularly since the villages on the southern end of this island are suddenly inundated with deer. And they used to live in the woods, and I'm wondering if all these changes have anything to do with that. I don't think that you guys have got into that, but maybe future research may. Marcia may know.
Increase in herbaceous layers of cover, and I would think that would be perfect for deer. My husband says,
Thank you. That is a great comment. I didn't know if people felt more comfortable with me right now. That's why I was running around. I'm sorry. Great points. Students, we have, okay, perfect. They are taking notes as we receive comments. Thank you.
Well, you said you did 3 of the 8 vegetation plots? So are you coming back? No, it's fascinating.
Okay. I feel, yeah. Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Eric Allness. I'm the Northern Sites Manager. So Buxton Woods is one of my sites. But first off, thank you guys so much for doing phenomenal research this year in Buxton Woods. It's really exciting to see this kind of research occurring in a place that is reserved for research, education, and stewardship. And part of my job is managing these woods, as you know. So informing that management through scientific studies like you guys just had, it helps me out a lot, and it helps our agency out a lot, and it helps these communities out a lot because we're better managing these landscapes. So awesome job, congratulations, and I hope you guys enjoyed your semester on the Outer Banks.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric.
Thank y'all. You did a great job. It was really wonderful and professional. For the 11 new species, or the new species, so those weren't invasive species. They were native plants. Yeah.
Yes, no, they were they were all native species except for one, which my counterpart Jane will talk about.
There was one invasive sedge and one invasive fingergrass.
Thank you. Good.
And they were found at really small levels, which is why they weren't on the pie chart, so.
I will say, like, on the human dimensions side, a lot of people were concerned with that and said they had seen pine beetles, gypsy moths, and Russian olives coming in. We didn't see any of those. That could be something to look at in future research, but none of our plots had any of those, and we weren't looking for any invasive bugs, so.
How long ago were the sites, first of all, great presentation. Sorry, I should have started with that. Really great. How long ago were the sites grazed? I have a follow-up. How long ago were the sites grazed by cattle?
I think all through the 1800s and, like, you know, as soon as they were colonized, that continued. And I believe in the early 1900s, when penning laws started to happen, so people actually had to, you know, corral their livestock.
So I'm guessing these sites burned a lot, right? I mean, they were probably burned to provide really fresh, young, new, herbaceous forage for the cattle. That's how, you know, you get really good forage for animals without having to plant it, is you keep burning that herbaceous stuff. So did you see any evidence of that? Any evidence of fire? Or because that definitely influenced the landscape and would probably still persist today.
No, from the preliminary research we've looked at so far regarding fire of the species found do not like fire. So I think since they, especially the species that were found at a greater than 5%, so that were super popular at our plots, don't like fire. So I would assume that if they were prevalent, there hasn't been fire in a while.
We thank the good Lord for no fires.
I also just wanted to mention really quickly that fire was a big thing that came up, at least in my interview and a couple other ones, about that as a management strategy as well.
So they wouldn't have to be fire tolerant, really, because they were probably really low intensity. So the fire wouldn't have been this massive rager. It would be a very cool follow-on, I think. Maybe some tree rings, do a little dendrochronology. You guys should stick around.
That would be really interesting for future research.
Good job, guys. I really liked your presentation. And I was just wondering if any of you, or maybe if any of the community members, knew when like official protection of the area began, or if you're aware of any like significant changes in that during your study time period.
The protection began in around, I believe 1988. So that's around what time it started. The state of North Carolina bought around 152 acres, and now it's nearly 1,000 acres. I was supposed to mention that on my slide, my bad.
You got it now, it's good.
I mentioned it now, though.
I think one more interesting follow-up would be, instead of to just qualitatively look at some of the social benefits now, would be to measure some of those ecosystem benefits that are actually, you're able to quantify and put a value on this land, aside from the very important social role, which was so interesting to hear about how it brings this community together. There are some real measures to be made, probably, of the ecosystem benefits that remain. So, gosh, you've just laid the groundwork for so much amazing stuff. Well done.
Yeah, I agree. I think like if we were here for a whole year, it would be really interesting to try and quantify that, but we're only here for 3 months. But a lot of people talked about how it was just absolutely essential to their well-being and contributed to their quality of life greatly.
And I think this research was the start of future research. Our research will probably be the cornerstone that will probably lead to more research on maritime forests and how they interact with the community. So we're just honored to be the first group to do this.
Yeah. So I noticed there were some plots in the reserve that are still private. And I'm wondering if maybe the development of those plots or the lack of development or how those plots have been changed in since 1988. Were they more developed? Maybe before, I don't know. It was just a thought.
Could you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so in the big plot of the Coastal Reserve, there were still some private holdings in that plot. And I'm wondering if they've been developed. Yeah, right there. So you can see some pretty substantial ones that go, really go into the plot. I guess there's like one's a big L-shaped one, and there's a big one. And if they've been are they all development now, or were they in 1988? Could that have affected what was going on? Would they be more developed they would be more developed than the Coastal Reserve?
So we came in on Old Doctors Road, which is actually in a pretty intact part of the forest, as you can see on the map on the left. I was thinking about this the other day, in the future, looking at other plots that are closer to where those broken up areas are, so where the forest is really susceptible to wind damage and salt spray. I think in the future we'll be able to look more at that. Old Doctors Road is a road, but it's relatively non-intrusive, as far as roads and development goes. But yeah, again, future research could be great to look at that.
We keep thinking of more things you can research, but I would love to see it expanded sometime into vertebrates and invertebrates, and I just know that there's already some pretty good baseline data out there from other people who've done their grad thesis work on that, and so again, just come back.
That would be awesome. I hope they get to do that in the future.
I think this might be a question for the person who's managing the Coastal Reserve at the moment. I'm sorry, I can't remember your name.
Hi, Eric.
Hi, I'm Shay. Nice to meet you. But is there a possibility of any further purchases of some of the land that's not in the reserve, that's still private?
Yes. Yeah, we always look at acquisitions and the additions that go into Buxton Woods and see their value to the reserve itself. So it's always an option.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Great. Okay, thank you.
And kind of after that exchange, I want to say that I think that the conversation is really important. And so if these microphones are inhibiting that, we can stop using them. So, because these exchanges are really why we wanted to be here rather than at CSI. So. Thank you all so much once again for coming. Please be in contact if you would like to learn more or be in communication about future iterations of research projects with these students or others. So thank you so much. Thank you. Okay.